I'm John David. I'm a research coordinator at an organization called the Black Community Resource Center. I've been there since February 2020, and my role at this point is to really oversee all of the research projects being conducted by the BCRC.
My name is Morgan Gagnon. I'm a policy researcher with the Provincial Employment Roundtable, or PERT is our acronym. Our research team is our Director of Policy Research and three other research team members. I'm one of those three. And we look at the employment of English speakers across Quebec. So we've taken on a couple foundational projects so far, looking at the employment and economic status of English speakers across Quebec, looking at the accessibility of French language training.
That was a project that was observing and trying to understand the vitality of the English-speaking Black community in Quebec. So it was fairly broad, wide-ranging, and education was one of the thematic areas we covered, and so was employment and employability. Essentially, the principal research question revolves around what are the experiences of members of the English-speaking Black community in Quebec's educational system. I think for me, the key word in that question was experiences. How do we kind of get a sense of people's experience? How do we record it, document it, measure it?
I think we also started off with an interest in the concept of academic streaming, which is the practice of assorting or categorizing students according to their academic ability. And we'd seen research coming out of Ontario finding that that practice in Ontario high schools was discriminatory towards Black students. We wanted to find out if there was something similar, or if there were similar practices happening in Quebec.
In terms of the data we collected for our research, we essentially sought information from two spaces. And the first way was through conducting focus group interviews, or I should say, to some degree, some group interviews, some individual interviews with people from the English-speaking Black community about their experiences. These were all people who weren't in school at the time, that we were asking them about their experiences looking back during their time in school. So to be in a room with other members of the English-speaking Black community to talk about this issue from the perspective of a member of this community, we thought was rather important. The second way that we wanted to collect data was through surveying. That way we could kind of collect information from a lot more people, and also collect information from people who weren't part of the English-speaking Black community, so that we could also compare outcomes and compare experiences.
So I think the mixed methodology approach is very important for a lot of different reasons. The quantitative piece gives us, through the surveys, like hard statistics that we can use to kind of show a statistically significant point, and the qualitative data gives us so much more context than what the numbers show. But I think what's really important about the survey in particular is that Quebec doesn't collect data according to race or linguistic identity.
This policy of not collecting race-based or linguistic data in Quebec leads to the kind of work we do, makes it all the more important, the kind of research that we're trying to conduct at the BCRC, that PERT is doing as well. Because without that information, there's a lot of blind spots when it comes to the community. And essentially what we found after kind of conducting what's called a ANOVA, analysis of variance, between the answers of Black respondents, non-Black respondents. It wasn't just non-Black, but also categorized as Asian or white. What we found was that there were significant differences across a few of the outcomes, or across a few of the questions that we asked them. These differences were particularly on the subject of punishment, facing punishment in school as part of their experience, discipline, and also humiliation. The Black respondents had a statistically significant difference in their responses compared to white responses or everyone else, basically.
And I think that deepens kind of the portrait or the information that we're getting through the census data, because the census data, as our other kind of primary source of statistical data, can tell us things like unemployment rates, education levels, income levels, poverty levels, industries where people work, kind of these different statistical points that can allow us to develop a certain portrait of the community?
Quite a few people had done their post-secondary education, had a degree or diploma, and then went into the workforce, and then came back later
Yeah.
to go went back to school basically, and started a new kind of educational path. They didn't really have anyone to speak to about what program was the best or best for them. We know already from background research that there's a lot of underrepresentation across some sectors in the Montreal or Quebec economy. So for instance, like natural sciences, finance, we were really interested in terms of like what role the school or the university or the CEGEP is playing in either perpetuating that or helping to resolve it, if any role. So for me, I guess the advice people got about where um, about the academic path they should follow was a very important indicator. More just writing, stepping back for a second, the access to counseling and information was a very important factor. Access to French language was a very important factor, a very important indicator. And then the last thing is their experiences. Some people had kind of really traumatizing experiences at school, even from people who who were supposed to really be taking care of them, whether it's school staff or even some teachers or even some classmates. So again, based on the results, they kind of show that there's issues with sense of belonging. People had bad experiences. Oftentimes they revolved around discrimination, racial discrimination, and the relationship of language to identity. It's a very fascinating subject. One thing that did stand out in this report for me in the interviews was that there seems to be, for some people, a gap between Black identity, particularly English speaking, and Quebec, being a Quebecer or a Quebecois. And they kind of felt that in their experience and all their messaging they've received about what it means to be a Quebecois or a real Quebecer, quote unquote, that somehow that wasn't really aligned with a Black identity.
We also heard from some participants who would identify themselves as maybe like an English-speaking Montrealer or like a Black Canadian.
As we know, Bill 101 was introduced and essentially distinguished English people who were eligible for English language education and those who weren't. There's a lot of terminology used, but sometimes we refer to the people who are eligible as historic Anglophones. And essentially with a large part of the Black community, English speaking or not, being first generation immigrants, a lot of people were then essentially forced to go to a French language education, despite being English speakers at home. This was a very hard transition to make, one that they weren't really ready for. And even once they were in the educational setting, they struggled in large part to even navigate it. So the shock of it, the shock of going into a new school, a new language for your schooling, especially as a child, it was quite significant. Then on top of that is also the idea of now being forced to go. It's not a consensual decision. I could just say, at least in terms of the spectrum, at the worst end of it, for some people, it was highly traumatizing to be forced to go into a French educational system.
I think we were curious to see if there would be instances where students, because of a language barrier, would present as having like a learning disability or a learning difficulty.
It's quite complex because we also considered this question of, well, in terms of being streamed in Quebec, how does that happen? Who makes that decision? Are suggestions and actually determined by the instructor at the school, as opposed to any course you want to take. And it's oftentimes justified by your performance, your academic performance previously, in terms of suggesting what course and essentially putting you as well into a specific course. Now, how would this play out as an example? Some people who know that they want to go into the sciences or into health or into mathematics, computer science, or anything like that, they might take a few courses in high school that are higher level, advanced, to prepare them for that path. And someone who would want to do that course, but who has a teacher who doesn't feel that their previous academic performance before is good enough, might not have the chance and might kind of be told that they can't take that course, that they have to take a lower course. And academic streaming is essentially when the educational institution shapes your choice, shapes what's available to you, shapes the opportunities available to you, and sometimes cuts off certain opportunities to you based on their judgment. So essentially, the question we had was, how does that designation happen? Who's really in charge of it? Is it a psychologist who does it, who determines whether your child has a learning disability? Is it the teacher who does it? Is it the principal? How does that work? The question again was like, is this kind of being used as a tool to kind of keep Black students out of advanced courses? And what is the actual process of designating someone like that? Is there any recourse from the parent? Can we get a third party, a neutral party, to make that designation? And from what I found in a lot of the interviews, it just seemed like this was the opinion of someone at the school about the child in question. And there was really nothing too much more to it than that. This wasn't necessarily a diagnosis from a doctor or psychologist.
We know that one of the kind of barriers that Black Quebecers and English-speaking Black Quebecers face is access to healthcare, and the resources of both financial, linguistic, access to healthcare is to get diagnoses for those learning disabilities. And that, on the one hand, is incredibly important to ensure that these students get the resources that they need in a way that's proportionate to kind of the rate of diagnosis among other communities. So the fact of the matter is we don't fully know what the rates of streaming according to learning disabilities or quote unquote social maladjustments or other disabilities are.
So what the study says about the practices in the education sector in Quebec, in the context of the study, that there's a lack of resources that they could attain to kind of inform them more about what their educational options are.
They also, in that report, in the 2011 report, talk about the educational experiences of Black youth and the kind of the negative experiences in terms of discipline rates, in terms of dropout rates, that these reveal in their research, as we heard in ours, reports of individual discrimination. In some cases, teachers or academic staff overly disciplining Black students, things like that. But also the way in which neutral policies or policies that aim to treat everybody equally don't actually take into account the different circumstances that students are coming to school with, and therefore aren't really able to meet them where they're at to ensure their academic success. So I think our discussion of English-speaking Black students in French schools is a good example of that. Because students don't have access to the linguistic resources that they need to succeed or aren't able to operate in the language in which they would succeed. Similarly, kind of policies that are neutral might not look at the circumstances of children who are immigrants, who are facing other disadvantages or barriers. And I think in that we see policy failure. And that's not to necessarily say that there's a policy in place that is actively seeking to harm, in this case, members of the English-speaking Black community, but through lack of specificity or inclusion, intentional inclusion of these communities, neutral policies end up harming them.
In terms of academic experiences, I mean, a lot of the time this is happening to children. So there's people under 18. Mm-hmm. And to some degree, it can be very hard for anyone to kind of open up about suffering from a personal experience, especially in your childhood. So I think that's certainly something I want to consider, at least with regards to the people we spoke with. Second thing is that coming into Canada and Montreal as a new immigrant, education is really one of the main first things that is expected of a young person. meaning that when an issue happens or there's something that indicates there's a problem in the educational realm or with your child in that environment, it might be kind of not really accepted or acknowledged or something that's really easy to talk about at all, because it would suggest then that there's issues in the system that you as an immigrant might have put a lot of faith in. I would just say in conclusion, a lot of the concerns that we'd heard anecdotally from members of the community kind of matched a lot with our findings.
Absolutely. And the way that two other things that jump to mind are our class status and the way that uh, we see an overrepresentation of English-speaking Black Quebecers and Black Quebecers living below the poverty line, and the way that regionality, literally where you're geographically distributed across Quebec, affects your experiences, and I think your exposure to racism and linguicism. Like those are also facets, as you say, of intersectionality in Quebec.
Yeah, I think the urban-rural divide is one of those that we don't talk a lot about. It has a huge implication here. Black community is highly, highly, highly urbanized. Another thing I would want to say, it's not per se on this study, but it's something that it's still relevant throughout all the research BCRC is going to do, is studying race scientifically. There's a whole history behind it, the different definitions and conceptions of race in Quebec, in the Quebec context as well, and how some of those definitions do kind of also overlap with language. Some people refer to Francophones as a race of people, or the French race of people.
Yeah.
Other people would say, well, that's a language, it's not really a race. So there is still a need to have a wider discussion on how we look at race if we're going to study it and collect data on such a thing. And if we're asking the government to do so, or the provincial government to begin doing so, we have to have a very serious conversation about what they understand race to be.
We heard an anecdote, or somebody reported an experience in our focus groups of immigrating to Quebec and going to a French school as a young kid coming from the Caribbean and speaking English, and the experiences of seeing other Black kids in school and being like, okay, I'll hang out with them. But they're Haitian, so they speak French, and so they can't hang out with them. So they go to hang out with the English kids, but then they are mocked for because they have kind of like a British accent coming from the Caribbean, and so they don't fit in with the English kids, and all these different facets of linguistic and racial identity, and the way that they eventually found community with the English-speaking Black community, and had to name those facets of their identity, or kind of discover that those existed in the context of Quebec.